So McGill University, the International Relations Students Association of McGill, and the IRSAM Youth Advisory Delegation exist on the unceded traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, namely the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who are also known as the Guardians of the Eastern Door, and Anishinaabe nations. More specifically, our campus is built on territory that has long acted as a site of meeting and exchange amongst the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, who are the rightful stewards of this land. Our organization operates in Tiohtià:ke. We will be attending United Nations commissions in Manhattan, which rightfully belong to the Lenape peoples. Both of these locations are situated in the larger Turtle Island. We acknowledge that policymaking at international bodies like the United Nations can often perpetuate neocolonialism by facilitating an international agenda that denies the sovereignty of global South states and the agency of marginalized groups. By considering this in the policy recommendations that our team has created this past year, we are aiming to present more equitable solutions to issues in North America and across the globe that consider the intersecting identities of affected youth. So a little bit more about us. We are the Youth Advisory Delegation for the International Relations Students Association at McGill, IRSAM, which is a nonprofit organization in consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council since 2006. And we're actually one of the few entirely youth-led NGOs that has this status, which has made our team really aware of the importance of consulting with youth through making our policies. And our mandate is really to create inclusive platforms by engaging with governmental and non-governmental stakeholders to ensure the representation of youth in policymaking. So welcome to our workshop. Today you're going to be hearing from delegates that are going to be attending Commission on Social Development, which is going to be taking place next month, and Commission on the Status of Women, which we will be virtually attending in March. So we're going to start with Shivani's presentation on defining inequality and decolonization and links to policymaking, and she is a delegate on CSW 65, followed by the importance of historical context by Joy Kwok, who is the delegate for the Commission for Social Development 59. I'm going to be discussing steps to create more inclusive policies and some practical steps that your student organization can take to be more inclusive and equitable. And then it will be followed by social impact assessment and participatory engagement by Miriam Sabah, who's also the IYAD UN Communications Officer, as well as Muskan Bandi, who is the delegate for CSOCD 59.
So hi everyone, like Marilyn said, my name is Shivani. And before the rest of our team was going to get more into the history and context of how to bake inclusive policies, we thought it was really important to start with some definitions to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So the first term that we want to make sure everyone understands is colonization. So colonization can be defined as one group taking control of the lands, resources, languages, cultures, and relationships of another group. And it's very important to acknowledge that historically, colonization was practiced extensively by Western European nations, and this has led to the forced imposition of Eurocentric norms on cultures that were colonized. So an important example that we can relate to of colonization in the context of Canada could be the colonization of Indigenous peoples by Canadian settlers, which has caused the oppression of Indigenous peoples that continues to have harmful legacies to this day. Now, on the other hand, we also need to understand decolonization. And decolonization can be described as the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies and the superiority and privilege of Western thought. And it describes our effort as policymakers to dismantle structures of oppression and address power imbalances. So why are understanding these concepts important to equitable policymaking and what we all are doing with McMUN and international relations? So it's important to understand decolonization in policymaking because when we're engaging in this field, we have to recognize that many of the systems that we're working in, including the United Nations, often perpetuate colonialism and prioritize Western ideals. Therefore, by recognizing that these systemic inequities exist, we can make a conscious effort to acknowledge our biases and include diverse cultures and ways of knowing when informing our policies. And the last concept that we thought it was important to touch on and understand before we go on with our workshop is intersectionality. So, intersectionality, for people who haven't heard of it before, is the idea that people can be discriminated against through multiple lenses at the same time due to their intersecting identities. For example, an Indigenous woman may face discrimination not only for her Indigenous heritage, but also face sexism due to her gender. And the reason understanding intersectionality is important to equitable policymaking is because when we're making policy recommendations, we have to realize that marginalized groups often face multiple layers of systemic oppression. And as a result, we have to be able to tailor our policies to meet the specific needs of diverse groups. That means, for example, we can't assume that a policy oriented to tackling gender equality would affect a woman of all races in the same way, because some people may be facing another layer of oppression due to their race. So those are the main concepts we wanted to make sure that you guys understood today before we move on, and I will turn it over to the rest of my team.
Thanks, Shivani. Hi, my name is Joy, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about why it's important that we consider historical context in policymaking and what some examples are specific to the UN. So, why is it important for us to think about how what the history is behind the policies that are made? As many of you know, the history of policymaking has oftentimes been skewed to serve colonial powers' interests. That means that the states or even the organizations that have been historically powerful often benefited from colonization and taking advantage of weaker countries and peoples. This includes a majority of the countries that began the League of Nations and later on the UN too. We need to keep this in mind because pursuits of development programs or other helpful policies have often had an ulterior motive, and they've usually benefited one or more countries economically, politically, or by destroying opposing forces that they considered harmful or even inconducive to development. That leads me to my next topic, which is development in itself. And that's been a problematic definition over the years, particularly as the threshold to development was defined as being successful or as powerful as Western governments. Other cultures and traditional methods of living were disregarded and often replaced by these programs that tried to encourage civility or stimulate the economy according to Western norms. And of course, not all of these even worked in the different countries that they were implemented in, and some even had a more detrimental effect than before. It's important to keep these in mind because decision-making bodies are often quite powerful, especially when we're talking about the UN. You know, the UN has membership from most countries in the world, and they have tremendous impact. But even as policymaking groups like IYAD and McMUN, we also have a responsibility to be conscious of these points to ensure that our policies don't reflect these harmful histories. Now let's explore some of the criticisms that have been made about the UN and its history. Again, we're doing this to remind ourselves of the oftentimes oppressive history of the mandates, as well as reminding us that the UN always has room for improvement and growth. Some popular criticisms have been that, as aforementioned, the UN serves the most powerful states' interests. For example, we could talk about the power imbalance in the structure of committees like the Security Council, whose 5 permanent members, or P5, have veto power and can basically overturn any proposed resolutions if it doesn't agree with them. And this has been criticized to prevent many ideas or actions taking place that have been kind of democratically brought up. Another shortcoming that's often cited is the fact that the UN is inefficient or too slow at solving pressing issues. Although this is arguably a result of diplomacy or democracy, especially at as large of a scale as the UN, the nature of the UN makes decisive action really difficult sometimes. And some pressing issues that have not yet been effectively dealt with, according to skeptics, have been, for example, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, mass killings that occurred in Sudan and still do, or the ethnic cleansing of Uyghurs in China. Meanwhile, intensive operations like peacekeeping operations have also had instances where civilians were affected or injured in crossfire because they were mismanaged. Finally, we need to re-examine how economic development and success was defined and encouraged by entities like the World Bank, which forced some countries to accept their structural adjustment programs and other economic development and free trade agreements in exchange for financial support or even the provision of like basic resources that the country needed. These have come under criticism for their unforgiving nature and the long-lasting detrimental effects that they've had on the country as a whole, which are still being shown in some places today. I'll pass it on now to my other teammate. We'll talk about steps to create more inclusive policies.
Thank you so much, Joy. So I'm going to be talking about steps to create more inclusive policies and also a more inclusive team as a whole, so you can apply these practices to your student-run organization on your campus or any club that you are part of. So the first step is recruitment. So it's important to recruit a representative and diverse team and ensure that the people that you recruit are aware of the space that they occupy. So a good way to do this can be targeting underrepresented communities or organizations on your campus, as well as having questions in your interviews that kind of assess how self-aware team members are, as well as how aware they are of the mission and goals of your organization. The next step is inclusion and engagement. So a common quote is that diversity is the first and easier step, but inclusion is the key to leveraging diversity. So this essentially means that it's great that you have a diverse team that is representative of the communities that you're serving, but it's super important to make sure that all team members feel included and that they are contributing to the team as a whole in significant ways. So it's important that they all have the opportunity to contribute to the work that your organization is doing, and also to have a team environment that's really open and that's welcome to feedback from all team members. The next step is research. So it's important to figure out who and what you're advocating for, while also making sure that you are not telling people stories for them. So it's incredibly important to keep in mind positionality and creating platforms for others. And this goes hand in hand with the next step, which is consultation. So it's very important to consult with your community, particularly marginalized members of your community and NGOs that are advocating on behalf of them. So over last summer, our team had the opportunity to submit a statement to a Commission on the Status of Women, and it was on the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. So we made sure to consult with the Native Women's Association of Canada, and we used a lot of statistics and facts from their reports, but we wanted to make sure that the policies that we were speaking of and the background context that we were giving were all accurate and in line with what the organization was advocating for. And then the last step, which is really a step that should be present throughout your whole process, is accessibility. So it's important to always keep in mind that people have different needs and conditions, and it's better to prepare for that rather than doing it after the fact. Some examples of what our team has done this year is we've tried to use this font called Dyslexie, which can be seen by people with dyslexia, so that it's easier for them to access any applications that we have or any documents that we upload, as well as providing another outlet for consultation. So if people aren't able to meet with you through Zoom, or if they aren't able to attend a virtual consultation event that you're having, offering other avenues for feedback, whether that's through a Google form or emailing and reaching out to members of your community on different platforms. It's really important to make sure that there's several ways and several options that you're giving people to provide feedback to your organization and get involved with your organization.
Thank you, Marilyn. My name is Muskan, and I'll be talking to you about the various steps that are needed in part of creating policy. Through each of these parts, we see how effective and impactful policies are created. So the first step is issue identification, which is simply conducting a needs assessment to identify what the communities we are working with need the most. Conducting development work without a strong need in the community is not as effective. We need to conduct these in two ways, anticipating the need of what these communities require and responding to the needs. This can be put into context of the policies we create at IYAD and also the policies that are implemented in McMUN, where the operative clauses are usually solutions, right? So understanding how what these communities need or what these countries in specific need. The second one is policy formulation, which is simply gathering ideas and reviewing previous policies to see what has worked in the past and what has not. This step is imperative as it allows for us to formulate successful policies that have a greater outcome. The third step is policy pre-evaluation, which is essentially the social impact assessment, which I will further talk about in the next slide, but it simply involves evaluating the various domains of social life and assessing these domains to ensure that the policy that is created is effective in all ways. And the other one is decision making. So in terms of decision making, consultation with appropriate stakeholders, in this case, the supporters, the volunteers, the management committee members and service users or the beneficiaries. However, in terms of McMUN, it would probably be organizations such as IMF or the World Bank or governments in general or the allies to different countries that are involved in decision making. For the next part of creating policy is implementation. Implementation is we often suggest policies, but the implementations are done by the organizations and the government. So at most what we can do from our positions is evaluate how past policies have been implemented and see better ways that the governments and NGOs can implement policies. And the last step is evaluation, which is understanding that you have effective systems in place to monitor the impact of your work on the public, assessing how effective your work is, who it's impacting, and the shortcomings and the successes. So in case another policy is created on a similar topic, a different person or a different organization knows how to go about it. And this diagram the diagram on the left, on the right, just simply summarizes all these different steps. And this is the social impact assessment, as mentioned earlier, which simply includes the processes of analyzing, monitoring, and managing the intended and unintended social consequences, both positive and negative, of planned interventions, and any social change processes invoked by those interventions. Its primary purpose is to bring about a more sustainable and equitable biophysical and human environment. So in terms of this diagram, we can see how through the social impact assessment, we have to look at the cultural impact, the environmental impact, the project program and evaluation, economic assessment, hazard assessment, and risk assessment. This provides an overview of how the policies will turn out to be and helps us to be more mindful of the outcomes of the policies that we create.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Miriam, and I'll be discussing participatory engagement, which is essentially people's involvement in policymaking. And this helps introduce equity considerations into looking at the impact of policy options on different groups in society, kind of as a continuation of what Muskan just discussed with you all. So effective, accessible, and meaningful public participation is one of the most important things that you can do in creating equitable policy. Not only do you increase inclusivity and diversity, but opening up your work to different perspectives and receiving feedback from those that are directly impacted by your policy is extremely valuable in informing your policy and grounding in a tangible way. This can also help your policies become more effective and more user-friendly and user-driven. So we've talked about this throughout the workshop, and it's equally important here. Your participatory engagement needs to be as inclusive and as diverse as possible, which is why outreach is key. And it's going to be essential to reach out to groups that your policy will affect, and even groups that you might not think would be impacted by it. So I'd also like to emphasize and reiterate what Mary Lynn touched on earlier, which is that participatory engagement is meant to provide a platform for people and communities to voice their thoughts and ideas. It's vital that as policymakers, we're making sure that we're not shifting their narrative, censoring their opinions, or otherwise manipulating participatory processes. So the point is truly and fundamentally to provide them with a platform and a method to be engaged in policymaking processes. So now we're going to take a look at the continuum of engagement, which is the range of public participation processes you can engage in based on the extent of involvement and the role in decision-making going from least to most. So these aren't separated by definitive boundaries, they flow into and they build on one another. And given COVID-19, obviously the ways in which you engage with people have shifted a lot. And as I go through these different methods throughout the continuum, please keep a few things in mind. So most of your engagement is going to be online for the foreseeable future, which comes with a lot of accessibility issues in terms of reaching out to people and engaging with people. And we're limited in what we can do to kind of mitigate this, but focusing on inclusive outreach and open space technology like Zoom discussions and breakout rooms can actually help to mitigate these issues. So I'm not going to read this whole slide, don't worry. The recording will be available if you'd like to read through it all, but I will be touching on each of the different kinds of engagement that you can do from the least to the most in terms of involvement. So firstly, we have information exchange. So this is really mostly a one-way process. So for our organization, IYAD, it would be publishing our policy briefs online to engage with the public. You can do surveys, meetings, discussion papers, those sorts of things. The next step is consultation. And this is actually, this workshop would count as a form of consultation. This is where you have a two-way exchange, but it is mostly dominated by one party. This is what you'll do for the majority of your policymaking consultation, at least at this level of policymaking, as well as the third, which is engagement and dialogue, which is more of an equal partnership in terms of dialogue. So that's where you have the open space technology, conferences, and appreciative inquiries. So next we have, actually here we have an illustration of each of the steps that can help you kind of visualize the level of engagement that you can have across the continuum. So the last two are shared decisions, which is where you have your open houses, your surveys, discussion paper. Oh, sorry, actually that's the wrong definition. Techniques for that are actually delegation, legislative authorities, responsibility, and accountability. So an example of that would be a local board of education or children's services. And then the final one is shared jurisdiction. So this is where you really have an equal partnership in decision-making, so co-management, partnerships, collaborative processes, and formal agreements. And as I'd like to reiterate, you'll typically be engaging in consultation and in dialogue for the majority of your participatory engagement, but that's something that is a discussion for your team to make. You want to figure out what level of engagement and involvement that you want in your policy making. So I'll conclude quickly by reiterating what I also consider to be the underlying theme for this workshop. Your policymakers and your policy should be representative of the people that it will impact. We'll now be opening the floor to questions. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat and we'll answer. Thank you, everyone.